An Arkansas housewife brutally murdered.
There's a white female in the closet. She was dead, and at her feet was an arrangement of flowers.
Police learn this wasn't the first attempt on her life.
They had enough explosives to blow her to kingdom come, but it didn't work. It was a miracle the kids weren't in the car.
The investigation reveals her husband might have been the real target.
He was definitely the top criminal attorney in the state of Arkansas.
Doing criminal law work, you anger a lot of people.
But when detectives uncover the truth, they find a mastermind who's obsessed.
She worshipped him, thinking that he was the greatest attorney ever.
She can keep 3 stories juggling at one time and hardly ever miss a beat. She belonged to jail, hell yeah. She belonged to jail for the rest of her life, for sure.
July 2nd, 1982. It's late afternoon in Little Rock, Arkansas, when police receive a 911 call from a prominent defense attorney saying he found his wife murdered.
The original call came through our communications center, and one of our officers responded to the call, which was the address of Alice and Bill MacArthur.
As first responders arrive, they are met by the 911 caller, Bill MacArthur. He tells officers he had just returned home from work when he found his wife Alice shot to death inside their bedroom closet.
I go to my officer to get what he's got, and he kind of walks me back through the hallway toward Alice's and Bill's bedroom. The closet is a walk-in, and it's probably 10 by 10, and there's a white female laying in the bottom of the closet. You had to move some clothes out of the way to kind of see her upper torso and face. There's blood. Gunshot went to the head. The officer that got there first, he said he had checked her pulse. I went ahead and checked her pulse too. She was dead.
There's little evidence to explain why Alice was shot, but on the floor, police find something bizarre.
At her feet was an arrangement or a bouquet of flowers. The flower bouquet had a note basically attached to it that said, "Have a nice day." Right next to the door facing is a bullet hole in the wall. And down underneath the bullet hole was flower petals. So it's telling you a story. I think that whoever shot Alice brought the flowers.
Investigators waste no time scouring the crime scene for more clues.
We did get a spent round from the wall. It was 38. As we inventory everything out of the closet, we do find a handgun there, a pistol. And it was from one of the shelves covered up with folded clothes. Bill was there, and he was asked, whose gun is it? He said it was Alice's. I didn't think it was the murder weapon because the way it was found. I believe she believed that she could get a hold of that gun and maybe defend herself.
With no quick answers from the scene, investigators focus on potential motives.
I wondered who in the hell would do this and why. Bill was a, high-profile attorney, so you knew this was going to be a high-profile case.
Alice had a small circle of friends. She kind of kept to herself, but Bill was kind of in the forefront. One might suspect that he would be a target because he was the top criminal attorney in the state of Arkansas. So the investigators and people that were trying to determine what took place, it was more circled around, why would anybody be mad at Alice, or want to do something harmful? Why Alice?
Alice Miller was born in southern Louisiana in 1941.
She was from a small town called Golden Meadow, Louisiana. She had a couple of brothers. The mom and dad were still alive. Alice was a PE or gym teacher for the local high school. So she was very athletic.
In the mid-1960s, Alice met the love of her life, a young Arkansas lawyer named Bill MacArthur.
They met through mutual friends at a wedding. My brother had got his undergraduate degree, and then he went to the Army and served 2 or 3 years. He had gone to law school, graduated, and was real early on his journey to be a criminal attorney.
I thought they fit together pretty well. Bill was real laid back, and Alice was, driven's not the word, but she was kind of, front and center kind of person.
They were married probably in the late 60s. Bill's practice was just starting out. He was just getting a name for himself, building his practice up.
With Alice's support, Bill rose to prominence as a defense attorney in the Little Rock court system.
He had natural skills in the courtroom. He was excellent in closing the argument because he would just talk to people. He was just himself. He would point out reasonable doubt.
It wasn't too long before his practice had really kicked in. They moved out towards the Pleasant Valley area and bought a house out there. They had 2 children. She stayed home with them. She cared for them. She was very strong, very opinionated. Some would say she probably might have worn the pants in the family.
Alice was about the most direct human being you'd ever meet. You didn't have to worry what was on Alice's mind. She was real direct with me about anything. Bill and Alice, they frequently had neighborhood parties, and they always asked me out over there. I think the best couples I know, they're different just enough where they kind of pull and push each other where it needs to be done and fill in gaps and support each other. So I thought things were well over there.
She was a great mother. She was fiercely loyal to her family. And she and Bill, from what I ascertained and when I was around, were happily married.
Now, Alice has been shot to death in their bedroom closet, and Bill has found himself on the other side of a murder investigation.
Speculation was that she became aware at some point that somebody was going to hurt her, and she ran. She was trying to get to the closet because that was how she was going to try to defend herself. There would have been no reason for her to run to the closet except for that gun. We're looking for fingerprints. If you get a fingerprint, if you got a suspect, then you can make a case. I'm in the closet, and of course the bouquet is there on the floor. A fingerprint person had an opportunity to fingerprint some of the evidence to come up with a fingerprint.
The print is sent to the crime lab to see if they can find a match. But as police speak with Bill about possible motives, they begin to suspect Alice might not have been the killer's intended target.
I can't think of any reason anybody would want to kill Alice. But in doing criminal law work, you anger a lot of people.
In his line of work, you don't deal with the A-list of humanity, So, did he piss somebody off?
The officer's line of thinking proves correct when Bill brings up another recent attack on his family just 6 weeks earlier.
Alice was just jumping in her car and doing mom stuff. She started the car up. It wouldn't start first. Then she recranked it, and that's when it went off.
Coming up, shocking details of a previous murder attempt.
The mystery of it was why would they do that to Alice? Did they make a mistake?
But new questions arise when another mysterious shooting surfaces.
She said, "Something's wrong with my husband. He's bleeding."
Light bulb comes on. Oh, she's done killed somebody else.
Arkansas detectives are talking to defense attorney Bill MacArthur in the aftermath of his wife's murder. The officers can't help but wonder if there is a link between Alice's shooting and another attack 6 weeks earlier.
We had had an attempted homicide with a pipe bomb under Bill MacArthur's car. It was maybe a couple of weeks before the actual shooting. It was a pretty potent bomb. It took the floorboard and pushed it up all the way to the front of the seat. So, I mean, it hit her legs pretty good.
Even though the bomb failed to fully detonate, it was still destructive.
They had enough explosives to blow her to kingdom come, but it didn't work. It was a miracle the kids weren't in the car. The mystery of it was why would they do that to Alice? Did they make a mistake?
They were working that bombing as if Bill was the actual target because it was his car. Could it be somebody that he's represented and maybe didn't represent to the liking of the individual?
Investigators questioned anyone with access to Bill's client list.
We questioned him, we questioned his staff, and I don't think that there was anything discovered that indicated that that was somebody that he had represented.
Everybody thought it was an odd, crazy thing to happen, but she got back to her routine, you know, so life goes on, even though it was still an active investigation.
Though the bombing investigation hit a dead end, it's not long before a new lead in Alice's murder surfaces.
The Placer County Sheriff's Office received the information that there was supposed to be two bad guys in town from Chicago that was supposed to kill a high-value target.
The tipster says the name of one of the hitmen is Larry McClendon. While police are looking into the tip, the fingerprint results come in from the lab. However, they belong to a different man in their system.
The flowers are particularly important to the case because the fingerprints pulled off the bottom of the vase identified as Yankee Eugene Hall.
Yankee Eugene Hall was a petty theft criminal who had never engaged in any violence prior to this.
We have warrants obtained from Yankee Hall, and he is arrested, brought to Little Rock Police Department, and he was interviewed.
When detectives put on the pressure in the interrogation room, he quickly crumbles.
He kind of spilled his guts. He started talking and did implicate his partner, Larry McClendon. He gave him information that Larry was the shooter.
Hall's claim lines up exactly with the anonymous tipster who also named Larry McClendon as the gunman.
He said, Larry McClendon is he's a jailhouse friend is what he is. Yankee and him, they got to know each other in the jail and penitentiary.
Neither Hall nor McClendon appear to be professional killers, but Hall claims the woman who hired them was offering too much money to turn down.
She supposedly, according to Yankee Hall, was going to pay him $25,000. Yankee was going to pay Larry McClendon $10,000 to murder Alice MacArthur.
They rented a van, bought some flowers, went to Bill and Alice's house in Pleasant Valley.
They planned a flower delivery ruse to get inside. However, Hall says things didn't go as smoothly as they'd hoped.
Yankee Hall and Larry McClendon rang the doorbell at Alice's house as if they're delivering flowers.
Alice opened the door. He had the gun, and she took off running and headed up the stairs.
She runs down the hallway, and she's being pursued by Larry McClendon. She gets to the bedroom, and McClendon fires a shot at her. She runs to the closet, gets in the closet, closes the closet door.
She, I do not believe, was hiding in that closet. She was looking for her gun, which she kept. All her friends knew, everybody, that her gun, which she knew how to use, was in like a hat box or something.
She's rifling through the clothes on the shelf that's right there at her fingertips, basically. And he opens the door and shoots her.
If what Hall's saying is true, police now know the shooter and they have his accomplice in custody. But investigators are also eager to speak to the woman Hall claims hired them.
He said it was a lady by the name of Mary Lee Orsini. When her name come up, I had never heard it before. I mean, you have to look at everything. And it's not hard to kind of take that step and say, what does she think she would gain from it? Why would she have anything to do with this? Why would she be involved in this at all?
After hearing Yankee Hall's confession, authorities run a background check on the woman he claims hired him, 34-year-old Mary Lee Orsini.
Mary Lee lived in Indian Hills, which is almost the border of North Little Rock. She grew up middle class. Our middle class, you're just like everybody else. Everybody went to the same school. She did not see the need to go to school, and she dropped out of high school in 10th grade. She was just a pretty girl, and she had the biggest eyelashes glued on that you've ever seen. She looked like Tammy Faye Baker.
Mary Lee had been married twice. Her first husband was in the Air Force, and they had a daughter together before splitting up. But her second marriage to a man named Ron Orsini ended in tragedy almost a year prior to Alice's death. On the morning of March 12, 1981, Mary Lee called 911 in a panic, asking for medical assistance.
She said, "Something's wrong with my husband. He's bleeding. It may be his nose. I'm not sure, but I need an ambulance." The first police officers got there. They go in the room, pull the sheet back, and then they saw half his head was blown away.
When officers asked Mary Lee what happened, she claimed Ron went to bed alone around 10 p.m., and she found him that way in the morning.
Her story was her daughter was sick, so she slept in the bed with Tiffany across the hall from Ron's bedroom. They said, "You sure you didn't hear any gunshots like in Ron's room?" And she was, "No, I didn't." And Tiffany didn't. She was just, "Well, I was just really tired." She said to the police, maybe he shot himself. But if he shot himself, then he managed to hide the gun somewhere, and they could not find it.
Mary Lee had a questionable story, but detectives needed more evidence to make an arrest.
When you fire a gun, there's blowout or blowback, depending on how you're holding it. So the shooter gets some of the powder from the force of the bullet going out. She had nothing, which either meant she didn't fire a gun or she did. And she had taken a full-on shower or bath and scrubbed everything off.
Investigators were stalled until they got a call from a private investigator named Fred Myers.
After Ron Orsini was killed, within a couple of days, I called the prosecutor and I told him about my involvement with Mary Lee Orsini. It was in the first week of November 1980. I was told there was a lady on the phone by the name of Mary Lee Orsini that wanted to talk with me. So I spoke with her. She told me she would like to see me about a personal matter.
Myers said Mary Lee showed up looking like a femme fatale.
Usually when people set an appointment with me and came into the office, it might be a business attire. And she came in with a tight-fitting silk blouse, open down the middle. She had on a skirt, and it was split on the side. She told me that her husband was Ron Orsini, and she had come to me to do what is commonly known as an activities check on her husband. She told me that she was virtually certain, she said, that Ron had become involved in the buying and selling and transporting drugs. I told her that we would have to do a surveillance. We watched him for the next week, starting on Monday morning. We did that every day, Monday through Friday, and we saw nothing out of the ordinary.
But Myers told the prosecutor he did find something of note.
We determined that they were behind on their bills. The credit report told me that, and it had included delinquency on their home mortgage.
In fact, financial issues made it difficult for Mary Lee to pay Myers for his services.
I was telling her that I cannot keep working unless you can pay me. She made the statement, well, perhaps we could barter. I said, what do you have that you can give me that would compensate for the money that you owe me? She told me, come to my house.
Uncomfortable with Mary's insinuation, Fred quickly rejected the invite.
She said, I'll give you a time, or we can meet somewhere and we can discuss it. Well, I did not accept the invitation for either one.
After receiving the tip from Myers, prosecutors looked into the Orsini's finances and found a motive for murder.
They didn't have any money. She didn't have grounds for divorce. She would lose everything if they got a divorce. But at some point, they decided to get life insurance.
Myers said after Ron's death, Mary Lee paid him another visit.
She asked me then if I would refer her to a good criminal lawyer. So I gave her the names of 3 criminal attorneys that I knew personally that I had done work for. And she chose Bill MacArthur.
Detectives investigating the death of Alice MacArthur have found the connection between her and Mary Lee Orsini. What's still unclear is why Mary Lee would have hired hitmen to kill her lawyer's wife.
My brother represented Mary Lee Orsini in a murder trial. She was accused of murdering her husband, and he was able to get her off. He was able to point out investigators took shortcuts or didn't dot their I's and cross their T's.
The grand jury returned a no true bill and did not indict her for her husband Ron's death.
That means the grand jury said, yeah, we don't know by the hard, true, beyond a reasonable doubt that she did this. She was just free. Just walk on out.
Clients usually want to get back at a lawyer who loses their case, not one who wins it. But when police dig a little further, they discover Mary Lee had different intentions.
As a result of that representation, Mary Lee Orsini developed the idea that Bill MacArthur had romantic interests in her.
I mean, she worshiped him, thinking that he was the greatest attorney ever.
I could tell she kind of had a thing for Bill. I didn't see that back the other way at all. Bill's this kind of dashing trial lawyer, and man, she's not his type.
After the trial, it seems Mary Lee kept looking for opportunities to see Bill.
My brother and two other partners opened up BJ's Star-Studded Honky Tonk. It was a country western bar, and it was huge at the time. I was there for a couple of shows, and I knew that Mary Lee Orsini was there and came by the ownership table, wanting to make an effort to come over and say hi to Bill. It made sense from her being infatuated with my brother. And in her mind, if Alice was out of the way, maybe she could have Bill. This was obviously was obsession.
A light bulb comes on. She thought that in the long run, she would have Bill, and then that she would have all the social ramifications and all his riches and everything else that she was actually desiring. And that's why she went and found Yankee Hall.
With new understanding of Mary Lee's intent, detectives resume their questioning of the hitman she allegedly hired, Yankee Hall.
He says, they met in like a bar. You know, I think that she went there to meet not necessarily Yankee Hall, but somebody like Yankee Hall.
She did have an appeal, and she knew how to use that.
He said that they had sex and that she was, seductive. She kind of prompted him into a lot of things as she developed the relationship, and eventually got off into this, what she wanted to do. At that point, they decided just going to try the bombing.
It would be difficult, if not impossible, to trace it back to anybody, but it didn't work.
After the failed bombing, Hall says Mary Lee asked him to find a shooter, so he called up his old prison mate, Larry McClendon.
The thing that stands out most in my mind is that he had no remorse, emotion whatsoever about killing Alice MacArthur. And as a matter of fact, I remember him stating specifically, "We killed that bitch."
Unfortunately, investigators know Hall's confession won't be enough to convict Mary Lee.
Yankee Hall was implicating Mary Lee Orsini and Larry McClendon, but he ain't got no evidence. You're not going to make a case on capital felony murder with a co-conspirator's testimony. You have to have something that backs it up. And I'll be honest with you. I mean, I was pouring over my case file trying to find something. I mean, anything.
Coming up, detectives get the break they've been looking for.
He said, she wrote everything she wanted me to say.
She'd given him a script to read, so the recording was completely bogus.
And the full story is finally revealed.
She said she wanted to come clean.
While looking for evidence that Mary Lee Orsini paid to have Alice MacArthur murdered, investigators subpoena her bank records. One transaction immediately catches their eye.
She got her mother to sell her house. She had actually gotten $25,000 over what she owed on the house. So Mary Lee put that in her account.
It's the exact amount Yankee said she was going to pay for the hit. But detectives still need stronger evidence to make sure Mary can't dodge another murder charge. They get a lead from the suspect herself when Mary brings them a tape with audio of a call she says she recorded while speaking with an anonymous tipster.
I'm sitting there going over stuff, and Assistant Chief of Police come in, and he hands me an audio tape. And he said, see if you can identify this guy on this audio tape. I get to listen to the tape, and during the conversation, he made a comment talking about his business, and I got the name from that.
The name they find is Larry Burge.
I eventually get him on the phone, and I tell him I need to talk to him. He said, well, I'll come in, and we get to talking.
Burge starts by explaining how he is more than just an anonymous tipster to Mary.
He said they met at bars and things like that a couple of times. That's how they ended up having a relationship.
Burge admits he was the one who called in the tip about the pair of hitmen just a few days into Alice's murder investigation.
He said that Mary Lee had instructed him to call Placer County Sheriff's Office and give the information.
The next day, he says Mary convinced him to recreate his previous anonymous tip with more detail so she could take the recording to police.
He, I think, gave it up pretty quick that she'd given him a script to read through on the phone, so the recording was completely bogus.
He said, she wrote everything she wanted me to say and how she wanted me to say it. I said, do you still have them? He said, yeah. He said, I'll go get them and bring them back to you. And sure enough, he had, I think there were 3 pages, yellow pages, notebook paper.
The handwritten notes provided by Burge match the recorded call that Mary Lee brought in.
I logged it in evidence and then sent it to the State Crime Lab for handwriting analysis. It was 100%. I mean, it was 100% Mary Lee Orsini's handwriting. We'd already taken a statement from her, so we had her handwriting to compare it to.
For investigators, it's strange that Mary Lee provided the real names of her co-conspirators, but they suspect she thought it would make the hitmen's story less believable if they gave her up. Instead, her plan has backfired.
Had not it been for the Larry Burge tape, we'd have never made a case on Mary Lee Orsini. As soon as we kind of got the go ahead on the handwriting analysis, they gave us the arrest warrant. And we went to arrest her. We transported her back to Little Rock Police Department. Her interview it wasn't that long of an interview because she was still denying everything. I mean, she was at the point when we first got her that she didn't know who Larry Burge was. She didn't know who Yankee Hall was. After taking a statement, she was charged with capital felony murder.
Mary Lee isn't the only one facing jail time.
Yankee Hall was arrested first, and I want to say that it was probably within 3 or 4 days. We had Larry McClendon. He was charged, and I'm pretty sure it was capital felony murder, same as Yankee Hall.
The 3 suspects were arrested, and they had a chance at them. That's kind of when things took a turn.
Now that the Pulaski County Sheriff has charged Mary Lee Orsini for Alice MacArthur's murder, she wants to talk.
It was in her best interest to tell the sheriff anything he wanted to hear. What he wanted to hear was there was more to this, that Bill was involved with her in this plot. The sheriffs didn't like my brother. In his department, there were lots of them that didn't like my brother because of simply my brother's tactics in defending clients. Because there's people, well, did your brother and her have an affair? Because nobody could imagine, how can you build this fantasy up if there wasn't something going on? It didn't make sense for a normal person. There was very little other than he had enough to be able to raise the charge, get it in front of a judge, and arrest my brother.
Despite Mary Lee's claims that Bill was involved, it's a move investigators at the Little Rock Police Department don't agree with.
Little Rock City Police and the Sheriff's Office, Pulaski County Sheriff's Office, were at odds.
There's nothing, absolutely nothing, no physical evidence, nobody's testimony except Mary Lee Orsini's that ever indicated that Bill was involved having his wife killed.
There wasn't any evidence, and so the grand jury returns a no true bill.
If there's a no true bill, meaning the state did not put together enough evidence to convince them beyond a reasonable doubt.
But, damage was already done at that point in time. Bill's psyche and quality of life was never the same after that.
Mary Lee Orsini's murder trial begins in September 1982. The star witness against her is confessed hitman Yankee Hall.
Especially in murder cases, the first thing that you want to do is avoid the death sentence. And the best way to do that is to turn yourself in, cooperate, and that's what we did with Yankee Hall.
Her defense is that Yankee Hall made all this stuff up. And that, Larry Burge and all the notes, they don't mean anything because she didn't write them. She denied it, basically. And that's kind of the way her defense attorney went with it, is that we don't have anything.
The jury sides with prosecutors, convicting Mary Lee of capital murder. Yankee Hall and Larry McClendon face justice as well.
Mary Lee Orsini and Yankee Hall both got life in prison without parole. Larry McClendon got 20 years.
She belonged to jail, hell yeah. She belonged to jail for the rest of her life, for sure.
In 1983, Mary Lee is also found guilty for the murder of her husband, Ron Orsini. But the conviction is overturned.
They charged her with being an accessory to the homicide of her husband. But in the trial, they didn't show anybody else there but her.
It's not until 2003 that Mary Lee finally comes clean about her role with investigators.
She ended up dying in prison, and prior to her death, she gave a deathbed confession, both to her involvement in the Ron Orsini case and her involvement in the Alice MacArthur case.
She contacted the prosecuting attorney and said she would like to talk to investigators from his office. He ultimately sent them down. She told them that she shot her husband and killed him. To quote her words in the interview, she found Jesus. She turned to religion. She said she confessed her sins and Jesus forgave her, and she wanted to clear the record.
I think it's very possible that people do things that are completely out of character and truly do snap. But I think for her, she was evil.
She's manipulative, she's remorseless, she's smart, she can keep 3 stories juggling at one time and hardly ever miss a beat.
This is all just some deranged woman that had an obsession and decided to act on it. The person that was probably the most innocent out of everybody would have been Alice. She had nothing to do with, she didn't bring any of that on herself. She had nothing to do with Mary Lee Orsini.
California 1998 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough exposes trusted neighbor. It began with a smell that didn't belong. Faint, metallic, almost polite at first. The kind of scent that makes you pause without knowing why. Late August 1998. Heat pressing down on a quiet California street where nothing ever happened, where routine was everything, where danger was something that lived on television, never behind the next door. 6:42 p.m. A garden hose running, water hitting dry grass. A woman stops mid-motion. Her nose tightens. Something is wrong. She turns, slowly, toward the house beside hers. Windows closed. Curtains drawn too early for daylight. No movement. No sound. Just stillness. By sunrise, the smell had thickened. It clung to the air. It lingered in the throat. By noon, someone called the police. By evening, the street would never be the same again. The door didn't resist. That was the first detail officers would later repeat. No broken lock. No forced entry. Just a quiet click as it opened into a house that felt abandoned. The living room was clean, controlled. A glass of water left half-finished. Dust already beginning to settle in thin, uneven layers. The television silent. No music. No sign of interruption. Then the hallway. Narrow, dim, heavy. And at the end of it, truth waiting in silence. Melissa Grant. 28 years old. Kindergarten teacher.
Known. Trusted.
The kind of person parents smiled at, the kind of voice children ran toward. Her life was small, stable, predictable. She lived alone. She kept herself. She locked her doors. Except that night. Her body lay beside the bed. No blood.
No overturned furniture.
No signs of struggle. One shoe still on. The other missing, found later beneath the frame. Her eyes were open. Not wide. Not frozen in panic. Just open. As if she had seen something she didn't have time to understand. The room told no story. And that was the problem.
No chaos.
No violence.
No narrative.
Just absence. The autopsy deepened the silence.
No defensive wounds. No fractures.
No toxins immediately identified. Her system was clean, her body intact. But something had stopped her heart. Something close. Something quiet. Under her fingernails, technicians found what they almost missed.
Again.
Microscopic fragments. Not hers. Collected.
Logged. Stored.
In 1998, DNA was a promise, not a solution. The sample was too small, too incomplete. It would sit in evidence, labeled but voiceless. And outside, the questions grew louder. Who had been inside that house? Friends were interviewed, coworkers, family members, parents of students, delivery drivers, anyone who might have crossed her path. Nothing.
No threats. No arguments.
No fear in the days leading up to her death. Her life had been ordinary, which made her death impossible. Then attention shifted next door. David Keller. 42.
Divorced.
Quiet in the way that never draws suspicion. He lived alone,
Paid his bills on time.
fixed his fence, kept his lawn trimmed, waved when necessary, spoke when spoken to. Invisible in the most dangerous way. He told officers he barely knew Melissa, said they exchanged greetings. Nothing more. Said he had been working late the night she died. Said he came home, slept, woke, went back to work.
Simple. Clean.
Too clean. A neighbor mentioned seeing him outside late that night, near Melissa's house. He explained it easily. Taking out trash.
Getting air. Couldn't sleep.
Another neighbor remembered hearing voices.
Faint.
Around midnight. A man's tone.
Low.
Indistinct. Couldn't confirm. Then came the fingerprint. Partial. Smudged. Found on the inside of Melissa's bedroom door. Not hers. Not in any database. Not David Keller's. The investigation hesitated. Because suspicion without evidence is nothing. And evidence without clarity is worse. Days stretched. Detectives retraced timelines. Knocked on doors again. Replayed statements. Looked for cracks. Melissa's routine revealed nothing.
Work.
Home. Occasional grocery trips. Phone records clean. No unknown numbers. No late-night calls. No secret life. No visible reason. The case began to thin. Media arrived fast. Headlines hit harder. Quiet suburb shaken. Mysterious death. Cold case in the making. And then silence. Weeks passed.
Leads dried.
Officers reassigned. Files grew heavier with paper, lighter with hope. David Keller stayed. He didn't leave, didn't panic, didn't change.
He lived.
Morning coffee, evening television, lawn cut every Sunday. Same routine, same calm. He attended neighborhood meetings, nodded when people spoke of Melissa, lowered his eyes at the right moments.
Said the right things.
I can't believe it. Terrible tragedy. She was so kind.
Perfect.
Years folded over the case like dust. 1999. 2000. 2001. Technology moved forward. Faster computers, better databases, sharper tools. But Melissa Grant remained where she had been placed, unsolved, unresolved, unmoving. A cold case. The phrase settled into the file like a verdict. Detectives came and went. New eyes reviewed old evidence. Same conclusion. No clear suspect. No definitive cause. No path forward. Except one. The DNA. Small. Incomplete. But real. In 2007, someone reopened the file not because of certainty, but because of discomfort. Because something about the case refused to stay quiet. The sample was retested. New methods. Greater sensitivity. The science had evolved. What once was invisible now had edges,
Shape.
direction. Weeks passed. Then results returned. Partial profile. Still not enough for a direct match, but enough to search differently. Not for a person. For a pattern. For a connection buried in bloodlines. The database didn't return a name. It returned a possibility.
À distant relation.
A fragment of identity. And that fragment pointed somewhere investigators had already looked. Too closely. Too casually. David Keller. Not him. But near him. Close enough to disturb the silence. Because if the DNA wasn't his, then it belonged to someone who shared it. Someone connected. Someone closer than anyone had considered. The case shifted. Not solved. But awake again. Detectives returned. Questions sharpened. Old statements re-examined under new light. David Keller was approached again. Older now, slower, but still composed. Still cooperative. Still calm. He gave permission for a DNA sample.
No hesitation.
That mattered. Because innocent men don't hesitate. But neither do men who believe they are untouchable. The results came back. Not a match. But close. Too close to ignore. A familial link. A line that stretched beyond him. And suddenly, the quiet neighbor wasn't just a witness. He was a doorway. Into something hidden. Something buried beneath routine, beneath politeness, beneath years of careful normalcy. Investigators dug deeper. Family records, old addresses, estranged relatives, forgotten names. And slowly, a shape began to form. A second presence. Someone who had never been questioned. Someone who had never appeared in the original investigation. Because no one had known to look. And in that realization, the past shifted again. Because Melissa Grant hadn't died in randomness. She hadn't been chosen by chance. She had been seen.
Watched.
Approached. By someone who knew how to move without leaving noise. Someone who understood silence. Someone who had stood close enough to leave skin beneath her nails. And walk away. Unseen. For nearly a decade. Until science forced the truth back into the light. Until the smallest fragment of evidence refused to stay buried. Until the quiet street that believed it had moved on was forced to remember. Because some things don't fade. They wait. Patient. Unforgiving. For the moment when the past finally speaks. California 1998 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough exposes trusted neighbor. The silence didn't break all at once. It fractured.
Slow.
Uneven. Like glass under pressure. Investigators didn't announce anything.
No headlines. No cameras.
Just quiet movement behind closed doors, inside offices where the past had been sitting untouched for years. Files reopened. Names reread. Timelines reconstructed with a precision that hadn't existed in 1998. Because now they weren't guessing anymore. They were narrowing. The DNA didn't lie. It couldn't. Not anymore. It had pointed not directly, but unmistakably, toward a bloodline. Toward a connection. Toward someone tied to David Keller, whether by family, by history, or by something darker that hadn't yet been named. And suddenly, the investigation wasn't about what happened that night. It was about who had always been there. David Keller was brought in again. Same room, different time,
Different stakes.
He looked older. Of course he did. Time had carved subtle lines into his face, softened his posture, slowed his movements. But his eyes, those didn't change.
Calm.
Measured. Controlled. He answered questions the same way he always had.
Direct.
Careful. Just enough detail. Never too much. When asked about family, he hesitated. Not long. But long enough. He mentioned a brother. Younger. Estranged. Said they hadn't spoken in years. Said the man had issues.
Vague.
Non-specific. A distancing tactic that investigators recognized immediately. Because people don't describe family like that unless they're hiding something. Or protecting something. The name was new to the case. Mark Keller. No record in the original investigation.
No mention. No footprint.
It was as if he hadn't existed in 1998, or had simply slipped through the cracks unnoticed. That alone was enough to change everything. Records were pulled. Old addresses, employment history, criminal background. At first glance, nothing explosive. Minor offenses, disturbance reports, short-term jobs, frequent relocations. The profile of someone unstable but not necessarily dangerous. But instability leaves traces. And when investigators began aligning Mark Keller's movements with the timeline of Melissa Grant's life, the alignment became uncomfortable. He had been in the area. Not officially. Not documented in a way that would have triggered suspicion at the time, but close enough. Temporary work. A construction contract 2 blocks away. A short-term rental that had never been fully registered. Invisible. But present. That was the first real shift. Because presence changes everything. Suddenly, the idea that Melissa had been targeted didn't feel abstract anymore. It felt specific. Deliberate. And that meant someone had been watching her. Learning her routine. Waiting. The case files were reopened with a new focus. Not just Melissa's life, but the environment around her. The patterns. The overlooked details. The things that had seemed too small to matter back then. Neighbors were contacted again.
Different voices now.
Older. More cautious. Memories blurred, but not erased. One detail resurfaced.
A man.
Not David Keller. Someone else. Seen occasionally near the street. Not often. Just enough to register as unfamiliar. Standing too long. Watching without interacting. The kind of presence people notice, but don't report. Because nothing had happened. Until it did. Another neighbor recalled something stranger. A knock.
Late.
Past 10 p.m. A few days before Melissa was found. She didn't answer. Looked through the window instead. Saw a man standing at her door. Didn't recognize him. He left after a minute. At the time, it meant nothing. Now, it meant everything. Investigators reconstructed the timeline again. Melissa's last confirmed sighting. A grocery store receipt. 7:18 p.m. August 13th. She returned home. No signs she left again. No outgoing calls. No visitors confirmed. Except now, there was a possibility. A man at her door. Unidentified. Unlogged. Unquestioned. And tied, potentially, to a DNA sample that had been waiting nearly a decade to speak. Mark Keller became the center of the investigation. But he wasn't easy to find. Because men like him don't stay still. Addresses led nowhere. Phone numbers disconnected. Employment records inconsistent. It was as if he had spent years dissolving into the background, never staying long enough to be remembered. But DNA doesn't forget. And family ties don't disappear. Eventually, they found him. Nevada. Living under his own name, but barely. Working odd jobs. Keeping distance.
No stable relationships. No roots.
He didn't run when approached. That was the second shift. Because guilty men often run. But some don't. Some believe distance is enough. Some believe time has erased what they left behind.
He agreed to speak. Calm.
Cooperative. Almost indifferent. He said he didn't know Melissa Grant. Said He had never been inside her home, said he barely remembered that time in California. But memory is selective. And investigators had something stronger than memory. They had science. They requested a DNA sample.
He paused.
Longer this time. Not fear. Calculation. Then he agreed. Because refusal draws attention. And attention is dangerous. Days passed. Then results came back. And this time, there was no ambiguity. The DNA under Melissa Grant's fingernails matched Mark Keller. Not partial. Not approximate.
Exact.
And in that moment, 10 years of silence collapsed. The case wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a confrontation. Mark Keller was brought in again.
The tone changed.
Questions sharpened. Details pressed harder. He denied everything. Again. Even with the match. Even with the timeline. Even with witnesses placing someone like him near the house. Denial held. Because admission is final. But evidence doesn't argue. It accumulates. Investigators laid it out piece by piece. His presence in the area. The construction job. The rental. The sighting at her door. The DNA. Each fact placed carefully. Each silence growing heavier. And still he held. Until they asked one question.
Simple. Direct.
Why was your DNA under her fingernails? No answer. Just silence.
Long.
Uncomfortable.
Then shift.
A crack. Not a confession. But something close. He said he had met her. Briefly. Said she had invited him in. Said there was no violence.
No struggle. No intent.
An accident. A moment gone wrong. The explanation was weak. Inconsistent. But it was movement. And movement was enough. Because now the narrative had changed again. Melissa Grant hadn't been alone that night. She had opened the door. To someone. Someone she didn't know. Or thought she could trust. And that was the most disturbing detail of all. Because it meant the danger hadn't forced its way in. It had been let in. The investigation pivoted toward reconstruction. What happened inside that house? No signs of struggle.
No defensive wounds.
But DNA under her nails. Which meant contact.
Close.
Personal. A moment where she reached out. Fought back just enough. Or tried to. But too late. Because whatever happened happened fast. Quiet. Controlled. The kind of violence that leaves no noise. No broken furniture. No neighbors calling the police. Just silence. And a body on the floor. Mark Keller's story shifted again under pressure. Details changed. Timelines adjusted. He admitted being inside the house. Admitted touching her. But still denied intent. Still denied violence. But intent doesn't erase outcome. And outcome was final. Melissa Grant was dead. And his DNA had been left behind. For 10 years. Waiting. The case that had once been a question was now something else. Something heavier. Because solving a cold case doesn't bring relief. It brings clarity. And clarity can be worse. Because now the quiet neighborhood had a name. A face. A truth that had been living just beyond reach for years. A man who had walked the same streets. Breathed the same air. Unnoticed. Until the smallest trace of evidence refused to stay silent. And in that silence, something else lingered. A question that hadn't been answered yet. If Mark Keller had been there, if he had been inside that house, if he had left DNA behind, then why had David Keller stayed so calm for all those years? Why no fear? No distance? No reaction? Because sometimes the truth doesn't end with one man. Sometimes it begins there and spreads outward into places no one thought to look, until it's too late to ignore. California 1998 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough exposes trusted neighbor. The confession didn't come. Not fully. Not clean. It lingered in fragments, half-formed sentences, contradictions, pauses that stretched too long to be accidental. Mark Keller sat across from investigators, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes drifting not in panic but in calculation, as if every word had to pass through layers before it reached the surface. He had admitted being inside the house. That alone shattered 10 years of silence. But admission wasn't truth. Not yet. Because truth has weight, and Mark Keller was still trying to carry as little of it as possible. He said Melissa let him in. Said she didn't seem afraid. Said they spoke briefly. Casual. Forgettable. He couldn't explain why she would open the door to a stranger late at night. He couldn't explain how the interaction turned physical. He couldn't explain why his DNA was under her fingernails. And he definitely couldn't explain why she ended up dead on her bedroom floor with no signs of a struggle. So he filled the gaps with something softer. It wasn't supposed to happen. That sentence appeared again and again. A shield. A distortion. Because what actually happened inside that house didn't feel accidental anymore. It felt controlled. Investigators began reconstructing the timeline in microscopic detail. Not just the hours. The minutes. Melissa returns home at 7:18 p.m. Groceries unpacked.
Lights on.
No phone calls made afterward. At some point later, there's a knock. Not aggressive, not forced. A normal knock. She hesitates. Maybe looks through the window. Sees a man she doesn't recognize, but doesn't perceive as a threat.
Why?
Because threats don't always look like threats. Because sometimes they stand calmly under a porch light, hands visible, posture relaxed, voice steady. Mark Keller had that kind of presence.
Non-threatening.
Forgettable. The kind of man who could ask for help, directions, a phone call, and be let inside. And once inside, everything changes. Investigators believed the interaction was brief.
No prolonged conversation.
No drawn-out escalation. Just a shift. A moment. Something said or done that flipped the atmosphere from neutral to dangerous. Melissa moves toward the bedroom.
Why?
Was she trying to get away? To grab something? To create distance? We don't know. But we know Mark followed. Because his DNA was there. In the most intimate space in the house. The bedroom door. The inside handle. The threshold between safety and something else. And then, the contact.
Close. Sudden.
Her nails catching skin. Not enough to leave visible injuries on him at the time. But enough. Enough for science to remember. Enough for 10 years later to speak. And then silence. No scream reported.
No crash. No chaos.
Which means whatever happened next was fast. Efficient. Possibly restrained. The autopsy had shown no clear trauma, but that didn't mean there wasn't violence. It meant the violence had been precise. Pressure. Restriction. Something that leaves no immediate mark but ends everything. Melissa's eyes open. That detail kept returning. Because it suggested awareness. Consciousness. A final moment where she understood and couldn't stop it. Mark Keller refused to describe that moment. Every time investigators pushed, he deflected. I don't remember. It happened too fast. I didn't mean to hurt her. But memory doesn't erase itself like that. Not unless it's being buried. Because buried memories don't disappear. They distort. They fragment. And in those fragments, the truth leaks out. Investigators notice something else. Something subtle. Every time Mark described the night, he avoided one thing completely. Emotion. Not fear. Not panic. Not shock. Nothing. As if the entire event had been procedural. A sequence. Not an accident. And that detail shifted the case again. Because accidents carry chaos. This didn't. This carried control. Meanwhile, attention returned to David Keller. The brother. The neighbor. The man who had lived beside Melissa before and after her death. The man who had never left. Never panicked. Never even drifted. That kind of stillness wasn't normal. Not anymore. Investigators revisited his behavior in 1998. Re-interviewed neighbors. Re-examined statements that had once seemed irrelevant. Patterns began to emerge. David had known his brother was in the area. He had never mentioned it. Not once. Not during the initial investigation. Not when asked directly about visitors. Not when questioned about unusual activity. That wasn't oversight. That was omission. And omission, in a case like this, carries intent. The question shifted. Not just what did Mark Keller do, but what did David Keller know? Phone records from 1998 were incomplete, but not non-existent. Fragments remained. Landline connections. Call durations.
Dates.
And buried in those records something small but critical. A call.
Short.
Less than 2 minutes. Between David and a number later linked to a temporary residence used by Mark Keller. The night of the murder.
Late.
After 11 p.m. After Melissa had already been home. After the timeline had begun to tighten. That call changed everything. Because it meant connection.
Direct.
Immediate. Not years later. Not distant. Right then. Right when it mattered most. David Keller was brought in again. This time, the room felt different. Not routine. Not procedural. Focused. Heavy. He sat the same way.
Calm. Composed.
Hands folded. Eyes steady. But something underneath had shifted. Because now, the questions weren't general. They were precise. Investigators placed the call record in front of him.
No accusation.
Just fact. His eyes moved over it.
Slowly.
Then back up.
No surprise.
That was the third shift. Because innocent people react. They question. They defend. David Keller didn't. He acknowledged the call. Said he didn't remember it clearly. Said his brother contacted him occasionally. Said it meant nothing. But nothing doesn't happen at 11 p.m. on the night a woman dies next door. Not like that. Not quietly. Not without consequence. Pressure increased. Questions narrowed. Why didn't you mention your brother before? I didn't think it mattered. Why was he in the area? I didn't know. Why did he call you that night? Silence. Longer this time. The kind that fills a room. The kind that tells investigators they're closer than ever. David finally spoke. Said his brother needed help. Said he sounded nervous. Said he asked if everything was okay. That word. Okay. It hung in the air. Because okay implies something had already gone wrong. Investigators pressed harder. What did he say exactly? Another pause. Then he said he messed up. The room shifted. Not visibly, but internally. Because that wasn't confusion. That was awareness. David Keller had known. At least something. At least enough. Back in 1998. And he had said nothing. For 10 years. That silence wasn't passive anymore. It was active. A decision. A choice to let the truth stay buried. Next door. The investigation widened again. Because now, the case wasn't just about a murder. It was about what followed. The aftermath. The concealment. The quiet agreement, spoken or unspoken, that allowed a killer to disappear and a witness to remain silent. Mark Keller had committed the act. That much was becoming undeniable. But David Keller had held the door open for the truth to escape. And then closed it.
Carefully.
For a decade. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were aligning. Two brothers. One inside the house. One next door. One leaving DNA. One making a phone call. One admitting fragments. One withholding just enough. And between them, a woman who had trusted the wrong moment. The wrong knock. The wrong face under a porch light. The case that once had no direction now had too many. Because truth, once uncovered, doesn't simplify. It expands. It reveals layers.
Complicity.
Silence. Intent that doesn't always look like violence, but carries just as much weight. And as investigators pushed deeper, one realization became impossible to ignore. Melissa Grant hadn't just been a victim of opportunity. She had been caught in something larger. A presence that moved quietly. A connection that had been there all along.
Hidden.
Next door. Watching. Waiting. Until the night, everything crossed a line that couldn't be undone. And even now, with DNA speaking louder than memory, with confessions forming in broken pieces, with timelines locking into place, one question refused to settle. What really happened in that room? In the final seconds. When silence took over. And never let go? California 1998 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough exposes trusted neighbor. The truth didn't arrive as a single revelation. It tightened. Like a noose. Each detail pulling closer to something no one wanted to say out loud yet. Because now, the case wasn't just about a man who entered a house and left behind DNA. It was about two men. Two brothers. Connected by blood. Separated by silence. And bound by a night that refused to stay buried. Investigators shifted their focus back to the scene, not the physical one, but the invisible one. The movements, the timing, the behavior before and after. Because crimes don't exist in isolation. They ripple. And those ripples had been there all along. Ignored, misread, forgotten. Until now. The call between Mark and David Keller became the center point. 11:07 p.m. Duration, 1 minute, 42 seconds.
Short.
But loaded. Because in that window, something was said. Something urgent enough to break whatever distance existed between them. David had claimed his brother said he messed up. But what does that mean? In isolation, nothing. In context, everything. Investigators began reconstructing not just Melissa's timeline, but Mark's. Where he was before. Where he went after. How he moved. Because if he had left that house in a panic, there would be signs. Witnesses.
Noise.
Movement. But there was none. Which meant he hadn't panicked. He had left calmly. Or, at least controlled enough to avoid attention. And that kind of control doesn't appear suddenly. It comes from familiarity. From knowing what to do next. Mark Keller's background was re-examined with a sharper lens. Old incidents that once looked minor began to take on new weight. A complaint in 1993, unwanted entry. No charges filed. A report in 1995, harassment.
Case closed.
A disturbance in 1997. Neighbor claimed someone had been watching her through windows.
Description vague.
No follow-up. Individually, nothing conclusive. Together, a pattern. Not violent. Not overt. But intrusive. Observational. A man who watched before he acted. A man who tested boundaries quietly. And sometimes crossed them. Melissa Grant had never reported anything like that. But that didn't mean it hadn't happened. Because people don't always report what they don't fully understand. A stranger lingering too long. A presence that feels off, but not threatening enough to call the police. Those moments fade. Until they don't. Investigators return to the neighborhood again. This time with photos. Old ones. Of Mark Keller from the late 90s. They showed them to residents. Faces changed. Recognition surfaced. Not immediate, but uncomfortable. Yes, maybe. I think I've seen him. He looks familiar.
Familiar.
That word again. Because familiarity lowers defenses. And lowered defenses open doors. One resident remembered something more specific. A man asking questions. Casual. Too casual. About who lived where. Who was home during the day. Who lived alone. At the time, it seemed like curiosity. Now, it felt like selection. Melissa Grant lived alone. Predictable schedule. Visible routine. No known threats. She fit a pattern. And Mark Keller had been nearby long enough to see it. The idea that this was random faded. Replaced by something colder. Intent. Not necessarily planned in detail, but chosen. And that distinction mattered. Because it meant Melissa hadn't just opened the door to a stranger. She had opened it to someone who had already chosen her. Back in the interrogation room, Mark Keller's story continued to shift. Under pressure, details leaked out. He admitted he had seen her before that night. More than once. Walking to her car. Carrying groceries. Standing in her yard. He described her routine with a level of detail that didn't come from coincidence. It came from watching. And that changed the tone completely. Because now, the encounter wasn't spontaneous. It was the end of something that had been building quietly. For days. Maybe weeks. He claimed he approached her to ask for help. Said he needed to use a phone. Said she hesitated, but eventually let him in. That part might have been true. Because it fit her.
Kind. Trusting.
The kind of person who doesn't expect danger from a polite voice and a simple request. But what happened next, he still resisted. Investigators pressed again. Harder now. Because the gaps were narrowing. You followed her to the bedroom. Yes.
Why?
I don't remember. That answer again. Too convenient. Too empty. Because people remember moments that change everything.
Unless they don't want to.
Unless remembering means admitting something they can't take back. The theory began to solidify. Not fully, but enough. He entered the house under a pretense. He gained her trust just long enough. Then something shifted. Maybe a comment. Maybe a move. Maybe nothing at all, just an impulse that crossed a line. Melissa moved away.
Toward the bedroom.
Instinct.
Distance. Safety.
He followed.
Close the gap.
Contact.
Sudden. Close.
She resisted. Briefly. Fingernails catching skin. A reflex. A last attempt. But not enough. Because whatever he did next, he did it fast. Controlled. Efficient.
No noise.
No broken objects. No time for escape. And then it was over. Silence. The kind that fills a room after something irreversible. Mark claimed he panicked after. But the evidence suggested otherwise. Because panic leaves traces. This didn't. He left. Closed the door. Walked away. And then he called his brother. That call mattered more than anything now. Because it connected the act to what came next. David Keller knew. Maybe not everything. But enough. Enough to understand that something serious had happened. Enough to choose what to do next. And what he chose was nothing. No report. No warning.
No anonymous tip.
Just silence. A silence that allowed the case to freeze. To fade. To become a headline that disappeared. Cold case. 2 words.
Heavy.
Final. But not permanent. Because 10 years later, science had done what memory and silence could not. It had spoken. And now, investigators were listening. Every detail re-examined. Every omission weighed. Because the truth wasn't just about what happened in that bedroom. It was about everything that followed. The quiet cooperation. The absence of action. The decision to let a man walk away. Back into the world. Back into anonymity. And as the pieces aligned, one realization settled in with a weight that couldn't be ignored. This case had never truly gone cold. It had been kept cold. By silence. By omission. By a neighbor who smiled, nodded, and went about his life, while knowing something he never shared. And now, that silence was breaking. Layer by layer. Word by word. Until there was nothing left to hide behind. Except one final question. Not who.
Not how. But why?
Why Melissa Grant? Why that night? Why her door? Because in every case, there is a moment, a single decision, that changes everything. And somewhere in the quiet space between a knock and a door opening, that decision had already been made. Long before she ever saw his face. California 1998 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough exposes trusted neighbor. The question of why didn't fade.
It sharpened.
Because once the identities were no longer a mystery, once the DNA had spoken, once the timeline had locked into place, what remained was something far more unsettling. Intent. Not just what happened, but why it happened at all. Investigators had a suspect. They had a match. They had presence, contact, and a partial admission. But motive, clear, defined, undeniable, still hovered just out of reach. And in cases like this, motive is the difference between understanding and something much darker. Mark Keller didn't fit a simple profile. He wasn't a drifter without awareness. He wasn't a man with a documented history of violent escalation. He existed in a gray space, functional enough to move unnoticed, unstable enough to slip through boundaries without fully recognizing them. But gray areas don't explain death. So investigators dug deeper. They went beyond records, beyond reports, into patterns. His past relationships, short, fragmented, inconsistent, revealed something subtle but persistent. Control. Not overt. Not aggressive in a way that draws attention, but quiet. Gradual. A tendency to insert himself into spaces where he didn't belong. To observe. To linger. To push until resistance appeared. And then withdraw.
Until the next time.
It wasn't violence in the traditional sense. It was something more insidious. Because it relied on ambiguity. On the fact that nothing had technically happened. Until it did. Melissa Grant may not have known him. But that didn't mean he hadn't known her. Investigators began reconstructing his movements in the days leading up to August 13th. Small details began to align. He had been seen walking past her house. More than once. At different times of day.
Morning.
Late afternoon. Evening. Not enough to draw suspicion then. But enough to form a pattern now. He wasn't just passing through. He was learning. Her car. Her schedule. Her habits. Lights on. Lights off. Curtains open. Curtains closed. A life mapped quietly from the outside. And that's when the narrative shifted again. Because this wasn't random. It wasn't a spontaneous decision made in a single moment. It was a build-up. A silent accumulation of observation that led to a single knock on a door. And that knock, simple, ordinary, was the most dangerous moment of all. Because everything depended on it. If she didn't answer, nothing happens. If she calls someone, nothing happens. If she senses something off, nothing happens. But she opened the door. And in doing so, she crossed into his plan, whether he had fully formed it or not. Mark Keller's statements began to crack under sustained pressure. Not fully. But enough. He admitted he had thought about approaching her before. Said he had seen her alone. Said she looked nice. That phrase echoed in the room longer than it should have. Because it reduced her. Simplified her. Turned her into something observed rather than a person living her life. And that shift in perception, subtle but critical, often precedes something worse. He claimed he didn't intend harm. But intent doesn't always begin as violence. Sometimes it begins as curiosity. As intrusion. As a desire to step into someone else's space without permission. And once that boundary is crossed, everything changes. Investigators pressed him again. What did you want from her? Silence. Then, I just wanted to talk. That answer didn't hold. Because people don't follow strangers into bedrooms just to talk. People don't leave DNA under fingernails in conversations. People don't walk away from a dead body and call their brother to say they messed up. The truth was there. Fragmented.
Distorted.
But present. And slowly, under pressure, it began to take shape. He entered under a pretense. Gained access. Then stayed longer than he should have. Pushed further than he was allowed. And when resistance appeared, when Melissa tried to create distance, he closed it. Physically.
Decisively.
The act itself remained partially obscured. But its outline was becoming clear. A sudden escalation. A loss of control or a reveal of it.
Hands. Proximity.
Pressure. And then silence. Investigators returned to the autopsy with fresh perspective. Details that once seemed inconclusive began to shift in meaning. Minor bruising. Subtle. Almost invisible. But consistent with restraint. Not a struggle in the traditional sense, but a moment where force was applied just enough. Just long enough. To end everything. And that aligned with everything else. The lack of noise. The lack of chaos.
The speed.
This wasn't a prolonged event. It was contained. And that made it more chilling. Because it meant he knew when to stop. Or more accurately, he knew when it was over. The question returned to David Keller. Because his role wasn't physical. But it was present. After the act. After the silence. After the body was left behind. He received that call. He heard those words. I messed up. And instead of reacting, he absorbed them. Contained them. Buried them.
Why?
That question hung heavier now than ever. Investigators confronted him again. More direct. More focused. You knew something happened. Yes. Why didn't you say anything? I didn't know what to say. That answer didn't hold. Because silence isn't the absence of action. It is a decision. A choice made repeatedly. Day after day. Year after year. He could have spoken. At any time.
Anonymous tip.
Quiet report. A single sentence to the right person. But he didn't. And that transformed him from a passive observer into something else. Not the killer. But not innocent either. A man who stood close enough to truth to touch it, and chose not to. Investigators began exploring the possibility that David had known more than he admitted. Not necessarily the details, but the gravity. The seriousness. Enough to understand that a life had been taken. Enough to recognize that his brother was responsible. And yet he stayed. He lived next door. To the house where it happened. For years. That detail became unbearable. Because it meant every morning, every evening, every passing glance toward that house carried knowledge. Unspoken. Unshared. A secret woven into routine. And that kind of silence isn't accidental. It's sustained. It's protected. And protection implies something deeper. Loyalty.
Fear.
Or something even harder to define. The investigation expanded again, looking for any indication that the brothers had discussed it further. Any signs of coordination. Of planning after the fact. But evidence was limited. Time had erased too much. Or perhaps it had been erased deliberately. Still, the core truth remained. Mark Keller had entered that house. Mark Keller had made contact. Mark Keller's DNA had remained for 10 years. And David Keller had known something that entire time. Enough to act. Enough to choose.
And he chose silence.
The case, once cold, was now something else entirely. A structure. Layered.
Complex.
Built on a single act, but sustained by years of quiet decisions. And as investigators prepared to move toward charges, one final realization settled in. This wasn't just about solving a case. It was about exposing something that had existed unnoticed for years. Not just a killer, but the conditions that allowed him to remain one. A neighborhood that trusted too easily. A man who watched without being seen. Another who knew without speaking. And a moment, small, ordinary, forgettable, when a door opened and everything changed. Because in the end, the most dangerous part of this case wasn't the violence. It was how easily it blended into normal life, how quietly it began, how long it stayed hidden, and how, even now, with the truth finally surfacing, it still left behind a question that refused to disappear. Not how it happened, not who was responsible, but how something so close, so visible, could remain unseen for so long. California 1998 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough exposes trusted neighbor. By the time the case moved toward formal charges, the story had already shifted beyond a single night. It wasn't just about what happened inside Melissa Grant's bedroom anymore. It was about everything that had allowed that moment to exist. The quiet build-up, the unnoticed presence, the silence that followed. Because solving a cold case doesn't rewind time. It exposes it. And what it revealed here was something heavier than a single act of violence. It revealed a system of absence. Missed signals. Unasked questions. Unspoken truths. Mark Keller sat in custody, no longer just a name connected to DNA, but a man facing the full weight of what had been uncovered. Yet even now he resisted the final step. Confession. Not partial. Not distorted. But complete. Investigators pressed again. Long sessions. Hours of repetition. The same questions reframed. The same silence stretched thinner each time. Because people don't hold the same story forever under pressure. Eventually something slips. And when it didn't come as a dramatic break. It came quietly. I didn't think she would fight. That sentence changed everything. Not because it confirmed what had happened, but because it revealed expectation. He had assumed compliance, assumed control, assumed that whatever he intended, whether fully formed or not, would unfold without resistance. And when that assumption failed, the situation escalated. Fast. Uncontrolled. Or perhaps controlled in a way that had always been there. Investigators leaned into that moment. Why did you think she wouldn't fight? No answer. But the silence spoke. Because it pointed back to everything they had already uncovered. The watching. The observation. The pattern of choosing moments where he felt safe. Where he believed he held the advantage. Melissa Grant wasn't random. She was selected. Not for who she was, but for what she represented in his perception. Alone. Predictable. Approachable. Safe. The same qualities that defined her life became the ones that made her vulnerable. And that realization settled heavily into the room. Because it meant this wasn't just about one victim. It was about a pattern that could have continued. If not for one mistake. One moment where evidence refused to disappear. The DNA under her fingernails. That tiny fragment had done what nothing else could. It had preserved the truth long enough for science to catch up. And now, that truth was closing in. Mark Keller's story shifted again, under sustained pressure. More details emerged. Fragmented, but clearer. He admitted he had followed her into the bedroom intentionally. Not by accident. Not confusion. A decision. He claimed he wanted privacy. To talk. But investigators knew better. Because people don't need privacy with strangers they've just met. Not like that. The space wasn't for conversation. It was for control. Melissa had tried to create distance. He closed it. That much was clear. The contact escalated.
Hands.
Close proximity. A moment where the situation tipped beyond recovery. He described it as panic. But the evidence still suggested something else.
Precision.
Because even in escalation, there had been restraint. No excessive force.
No prolonged struggle.
Just enough. And that just enough was the most chilling part. Because it meant he knew when to stop. Not to save her, but because it was already over. Investigators returned to the physical evidence again. This time, everything aligned. The lack of disruption. The minimal bruising. The absence of noise. All pointed to a short, controlled encounter that ended with fatal pressure. Not chaotic. Not explosive. But deliberate in its execution. And then he left. That part never changed. He didn't stay. Didn't attempt to revive her. Didn't call for help. He walked out of the house, closed the door behind him, and stepped back into the night as if nothing had happened. That transition from inside to outside was almost seamless. And that's what made it so difficult to comprehend. Because for him, the moment ended when he left the room. But for Melissa, it ended everything. The timeline after that became clearer now. Mark leaves. Walks away from the house. Moves through the neighborhood without drawing attention.
No witnesses reporting urgency.
No signs of panic. Just another figure in the dark. Until he makes the call. David Keller answers. That call, once a detail, was now central. Investigators pressed Mark on it. What did you say to your brother? I told him I messed up. Why call him? Silence. Then, I didn't know what to do. That answer revealed something important. Not regret. Not fear for Melissa. But uncertainty about himself. About the consequences. About what came next. And in that moment, he reached out, not to authorities, not for help, but to someone who would understand. Or, at least not act. David Keller's role became sharper with every new detail. He had received that call. He had heard those words. And he had made a decision. Do nothing. Investigators confronted him again. More direct than ever. You knew your brother had done something serious. Yes. You knew it involved the woman next door. Long pause. I suspected. That word, suspected, was carefully chosen. But it didn't reduce the weight. Because suspicion, in this context, demands action. And he took none.
Why?
I didn't want to believe it. That answer landed differently. Because denial can be powerful. But denial doesn't last 10 years without reinforcement. Without choice. Without repetition.
Every day, he chose not to act.
Every day, he chose silence. And that silence allowed everything to remain hidden. The case that once had no answers now had too many. Because it wasn't just about Mark Keller's actions anymore. It was about the environment that allowed those actions to disappear. A neighborhood that didn't question unfamiliar faces. A system that lacked the tools to identify DNA at the time. A brother who chose not to speak. Each layer contributing to the same outcome. A case that went cold. Not because it couldn't be solved, but because it wasn't ready to be. Until now. As prosecutors began preparing the case, the narrative solidified. Entry under false pretense. Escalation in a private space. Fatal force applied quickly. Exit without detection. Followed by a call that revealed awareness, but not accountability. And years of silence that allowed the truth to fade. But fading isn't the same as disappearing. Because evidence doesn't forget. It waits. And when the time is right, it speaks. Loud enough to break through years of quiet. Loud enough to reach across a decade and pull the past into the present. Mark Keller now faced charges that carried the weight of everything uncovered. Not just the act itself, but the intent, the pattern, the aftermath. And David Keller, he faced something different. Not the same charges. Not the same direct responsibility. But something harder to define. Complicity through silence. A presence that didn't act. A witness who chose not to see. And as the case moved forward, one final layer began to emerge. Because investigators had answered most of the questions.
Who? How? When?
Even why in fragments. But there was still something unresolved. Something that lingered beneath everything else. A final, uncomfortable realization. This wasn't a story about a monster hiding in the shadows. It was about something closer. Something quieter. Something that lived next door. Smiled.
Waved.
Blended in. And waited. Until the moment came. And everything changed. And even now, with the truth exposed, with the silence broken, with the case no longer cold, that realization remained the most unsettling part of all. Because it meant the danger had never been distant. It had always been there. Unseen. Until it wasn't. California 1998 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough exposes trusted neighbor. The arrest didn't feel like closure. It felt like exposure. Because when a case survives for 10 years in silence, it doesn't end cleanly. It unravels. It reveals things that were never meant to be seen, forces people to revisit moments they thought were buried, and drags an entire community back into a night they had tried to forget. The quiet California street changed overnight. Again. News vans returned. Cameras lined the sidewalks. Reporters stood in front of houses that had once been nothing more than backdrops to ordinary lives. The words came back, louder this time. Cold case breakthrough. DNA evidence. Arrest shocks community. Neighbors who had lived with the memory of Melissa Grant suddenly found themselves living with something else. The truth. Or, at least, the version of it that had finally surfaced. Because truth in cases like this is never simple. It doesn't arrive whole. It arrives in pieces. And each piece carries weight. Melissa's name returned to headlines, but now it wasn't just about her death. It was about the man who had been there, unseen, and the man who had stayed silent next door. Mark Keller's arrest was immediate. Controlled. No resistance. No attempt to flee. That detail mattered. Because it reinforced something investigators had sensed from the beginning. He didn't see himself the way others now did. Not as a predator. Not as someone who had taken a life. But as someone who had made a mistake. A catastrophic, irreversible mistake, but in his mind, still something that had spiraled out of control rather than something he had fully intended. That distinction didn't change the outcome. But it explained the calm. The absence of panic. The way he had lived for 10 years without running. Because in his version of events, he hadn't been hiding. He had simply moved on. And that was something the community struggled to understand. Because for them, nothing had moved on. Not really. The house where Melissa died had stood as a quiet reminder. Owned, sold, occupied again, but never entirely free of what had happened inside. People spoke about it in lowered voices. Avoided eye contact when passing by. As if acknowledging it would bring something back. And now it had. Investigators began preparing for court. Evidence laid out with precision. The DNA match. The timeline. The witness statements. The call between the brothers. Each element forming a structure that could no longer be ignored. Mark Keller's defense shifted quickly. From denial to minimization. From absence to accident. He admitted being there. Admitted contact. But continued to resist the idea of intent. He described the encounter as something that got out of hand, a phrase that appeared repeatedly in his statements. But out of hand doesn't explain controlled force. It doesn't explain silence. It doesn't explain walking away. And it certainly doesn't explain 10 years without coming forward. Prosecutors understood this. They built their case not just on the act itself, but on the pattern leading up to it. The observation. The approach. The decision to enter. The escalation. Each step deliberate enough to form intent, even if he refused to name it. Meanwhile, David Keller faced his own reckoning. Not in the same courtroom. Not under the same charges. But under the same light. Because once the truth surfaced, his silence became visible in a way it never had before. Neighbors looked at him differently. Not as the quiet man next door, but as the man who had known. Or at least suspected.
And done nothing.
That shift was subtle, but powerful. Because trust doesn't disappear instantly. It erodes. Quietly. Until one day it's gone. Investigators continued questioning him. Not to prove he had participated, but to understand the depth of what he had withheld. Did he know Melissa was dead that night?
No.
Did he suspect something serious had happened?
Yes.
Did he consider going to the police? Silence. Then, I thought about it. That answer lingered. Because thinking is an action. Thinking is the space where decisions form. And he had chosen not to act. Again and again. For 10 years. The legal implications were complex. Failure to report. Obstruction. Possibility of accessory after the fact. But proving intent in silence is difficult. Because silence leaves no fingerprints. No DNA. Just absence. And absence is harder to prosecute. But not impossible to judge. Because the court of public perception doesn't require the same burden of proof. And in that court, David Keller had already been judged. The case moved forward.
Slow.
Deliberate. Every detail scrutinized. Because after 10 years, nothing could be left uncertain. Expert witnesses explained the DNA evidence. How it had been collected. How it had been preserved. How advances in technology had turned a fragment into a voice. That voice was undeniable. It placed Mark Keller inside that room. At the moment, everything changed. And no explanation he offered could remove him from that position. The defense attempted to introduce doubt. Alternative scenarios. Possibility of contamination. Misinterpretation. But the timeline held. The physical evidence aligned. The statements, however fragmented, pointed in the same direction. And beneath all of it, one truth remained constant. Melissa Grant had been alive. Then Mark Keller entered her space. And after that, she was not. Everything else was detail. The trial drew attention beyond the neighborhood. Because cold cases carry a different kind of weight. They represent something unresolved. Something that lingers. And when they are reopened, when they are solved, they remind people that the past is never truly gone. It's waiting. For the right moment. The right evidence. The right technology. To come back. Melissa's family sat through every moment. Years of silence, now replaced with words. Details. Descriptions of a night they had never fully understood. Now laid out piece by piece. Not just what happened, but how it happened. And that kind of clarity doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it brings something else. A sharper kind of pain. Because uncertainty allows hope. But certainty, even when it brings justice, removes that last possibility. As the case approached its final phase, One realization settled over everyone involved. This had never been a mystery that lacked answers. It had been a mystery waiting for them. Waiting for science. Waiting for time. Waiting for the moment when silence could no longer hold. Mark Keller sat at the center of it. A man who had once been invisible, now fully seen. Every action. Every choice. Every word. Examined. And beside that truth, another one remained. Quieter. But no less significant. David Keller. The neighbor. The brother. The man who had stood close enough to truth to hear it, and chose to let it pass. Because in the end, this case wasn't just about a single act. It was about everything that followed. The decisions made in the aftermath. The silence that allowed time to pass without consequence. And the moment, 10 years later, when that silence finally broke. Because silence can hold the truth for a long time. But not forever. Eventually something gives. A fragment of DNA. A memory. A question that refuses to stay buried. And when it does, everything comes back. All at once. Unavoidable. Unstoppable. And impossible to ignore. California 1998 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough exposes trusted neighbor. The courtroom felt colder than the crime scene ever had. Not because of temperature. Because of clarity. Every detail that had once lived in shadow was now illuminated under fluorescent light, stripped of ambiguity, placed in front of strangers who had no connection to Melissa Grant, yet were now responsible for deciding what her final moments meant. 12 jurors. 12 perspectives. 12 minds trying to reconstruct a night that had been buried for 10 years. The prosecution didn't rush. They couldn't. Cases like this demand precision. They began with silence. Photographs of the house. The street. The bedroom. No narration at first. Just images.
Still.
Controlled. Unchanged. Because the lack of visible violence was the first truth the jury needed to understand. This was not chaos. This was something else. Then came Melissa. Not as a victim. As a person. Her life reconstructed through voices that knew her. Friends.
Colleagues.
Parents of her students. Each one describing the same thing in different words.
Kind.
Patient. Predictable. Safe. That word surfaced again and again. Safe. And that was the point. Because the prosecution wasn't just building a case about what happened. They were building a contrast between who she was and what was done to her. Then slowly they introduced Mark Keller. Not immediately as the man responsible, but as a presence. A figure moving quietly in the background.
Seen.
Unseen. Familiar enough to pass. Unfamiliar enough to be forgotten. Witnesses spoke. Hesitant at first. Memories pulled from years ago, shaped by time but sharpened by context. Yes, they had seen him. Yes, he had been around. No, they hadn't thought anything of it. Because nothing had happened. Until it did. The timeline followed. Methodical. Unforgiving. August 13th. 7:18 p.m. Melissa returns home. Lights on. Routine intact. Then nothing. No calls. No visitors logged. Just a gap. A quiet space where everything changed. The prosecution let that gap sit. Because gaps create tension. And tension forces attention. Then came the knock. Reconstructed through inference, through witness recollection, through behavior patterns. A simple moment. Ordinary. Forgettable. Until it isn't. Because that knock was the entry point. The moment where trust intersected with intent. Mark Keller's presence entered the narrative fully at that point. Not as speculation, but as fact. His own statements placing him inside the house. His DNA placing him in the bedroom. At the exact place where Melissa's life ended. The expert witnesses followed. DNA analysts. Methodical.
Precise.
Explaining how a microscopic fragment collected in 1998 had remained intact long enough to identify him a decade later. No drama.
No exageración.
Just science. And science doesn't need emotion. It needs consistency. And this evidence had it. The defense attempted to disrupt that clarity. They introduced doubt where they could. Suggested contamination. Raised questions about the chain of custody. Highlighted the partial nature of the original sample. But the reanalysis held. The match was confirmed. Repeated. Verified. And that repetition built something stronger than doubt. It built certainty. Then came Mark Keller's own words. Recorded interviews. Fragments of admission. Played for the jury, without commentary. I was there. I didn't mean for it to happen. She didn't need to fight. That last sentence landed harder than any evidence. Because it revealed expectation.
Control.
A belief that the situation would unfold according to his terms. And when it didn't, something shifted. Irreversibly. The prosecution didn't need to describe the act in detail. They didn't need to. Because the absence of detail had already become part of the narrative.
No noise. No chaos. No visible destrucción.
Just a body. And silence. The medical examiner took the stand.
Calm.
Clinical. Explaining findings that once seemed inconclusive, but now aligned perfectly with everything else. Subtle bruising. Minimal. Consistent with controlled force.
No prolonged struggle. No excessive trauma.
Just enough pressure. Just long enough to end everything. The defense returned to their core argument.
No intent.
No plan.
No premeditación.
A situation that escalated beyond control. A moment of panic. But the prosecution countered with pattern. Observation. Selection. Entry under pretense. Movement into a private space. Each step forming a chain. And chains don't form by accident. They form through decisions. And decisions create responsibility. Then, unexpectedly, the narrative expanded. David Keller. He wasn't on trial. Not in the same way. But his presence entered the courtroom through evidence. The call. 11:07 p.m. Duration, 1 minute, 42 seconds.
Simple.
Undeniable. The prosecution didn't accuse him directly. They didn't need to. They presented the fact. Then Mark's statement. I told him I messed up. And they let the jury connect it. Because connection is more powerful when it forms naturally. David Keller was called as a witness. He walked to the stand with the same calm he had carried for years. The same controlled demeanor. But now, the room was different. Because now everyone knew. He confirmed the call. Confirmed the words. Confirmed that he suspected something serious had happened. And then, He confirmed that he did nothing. That admission didn't carry legal weight in the same way, but it carried emotional weight, because it introduced another layer to the case. Not just action, but inaction. Not just violence, but silence. The defense attempted to distance Mark from that implication. They framed the call as confusion, as uncertainty, as a brother reaching out in distress. But the prosecution returned to the timeline, to behavior, to the absence of panic. Because confusion doesn't last 10 years. Silence does. As the trial moved toward its final phase, the atmosphere shifted. Less about discovery, more about conclusion. Each side preparing to define what the jury had already seen, already heard, already felt. Closing arguments began. The defense spoke first. They focused on doubt, on the absence of direct eyewitnesses, on the lack of a clear, documented moment of violence. They emphasized the passage of time, the degradation of memory, the possibility that something had been misunderstood, that what happened that night was not intentional, not planned, not controlled, but something tragic, something accidental. They asked the jury to consider uncertainty,
To hold on to it.
because in the legal system, uncertainty can be enough. Then the prosecution stood. No raised voice.
No dramatic gestures.
Just focus. They walked the jury back through everything, step by step. Presence. Entry. Contact. DNA. Statements.
Timeline.
Not as separate elements, but as one continuous line. A line that began with a knock on a door and ended with a life taken. They didn't argue emotion. They didn't need to, because the weight of the facts had already settled into the room. Instead, they asked one question.
Simple. Direct.
If this wasn't intentional, then why did every step lead to the same outcome? Silence followed. Because there was no easy answer. And in that silence, something shifted. The jury didn't need to reconstruct every second. They didn't need to understand every detail. They only needed to see the pattern. And the pattern was clear. Mark Keller had entered that house. He had moved into a private space. He had made contact. He had applied force. And Melissa Grant had died. Everything else, intent, motive, explanation, orbited that central truth. The courtroom held its breath as deliberation approached. Because after 10 years, after silence, after science and memory and reconstruction, the final decision now rested with 12 people who had not been there, who had not known her, who had not lived next door, but who now carried the responsibility of defining what happened. Not just legally, but finally. And as they left the room to decide, one realization remained, echoing quietly beneath everything else. The truth had been there all along.
Hidden.
Fragmented. Waiting. And now, it had nowhere left to go. California 1998 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough exposes trusted neighbor. The waiting was louder than anything that had come before.
No voices. No testimony. No arguments.
Just silence stretching across hours that felt longer than the 10 years that had led to this moment. 12 jurors sat behind a closed door, carrying the weight of everything they had heard, every fragment of evidence, every contradiction, every detail that refused to fade once it had been spoken aloud. Inside that room, the case no longer belonged to investigators, or lawyers, or the media. It belonged to them. And outside, the world held its breath. Melissa Grant's family sat together, hands clasped, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. They had lived with uncertainty for a decade. Now they faced something different. Finality. Because once a verdict is spoken, the story changes again. It becomes fixed. Defined. No longer a question, but an answer. Mark Keller sat motionless.
No visible tensión.
No outward sign of fear. Just the same controlled stillness he had carried through every stage of the trial. As if this moment, this exact point, was just another step in something he had already accepted. Or perhaps something he still refused to fully understand. Across the room, David Keller remained present. Not required. Not compelled.
But there.
Watching. Waiting. A man who had spent 10 years in silence, now witnessing the moment that silence would finally collapse. Time moved differently in that space. Minutes stretched. Every small movement, every shift of a chair, every glance toward the door, felt amplified. Because everyone knew what was coming. They just didn't know how it would land. Then,
movement.
The door opened. The jury returned. 12 faces. Neutral. Unreadable. The courtroom stood. The air tightened. The verdict was handed to the judge. A single sheet of paper.
Simple. Thin.
Carrying the weight of a decade. The judge read silently first. Then aloud. Measured.
Clear.
Guilty. The word landed without echo. Because it didn't need one. It settled immediately.
Heavy.
Final. Mark Keller did not react. No visible change. No shift in posture.
Just the same stillness.
But stillness, in that moment, meant something different. Because it was no longer control. It was containment. Melissa Grant's family reacted differently. Quietly.
Tears.
Not explosive. Not dramatic.
But deep.
Because justice, when it arrives late, doesn't feel like victory. It feels like something returned but incomplete. Because nothing restores what was taken. The courtroom shifted again. Relief for some. Closure for others. But beneath it all, something remained unsettled. Because the verdict answered one question. Who was responsible? But it didn't erase the path that led there. It didn't remove the silence. It didn't undo the years. And it didn't answer everything. Sentencing came next. A different kind of weight. Less about determining truth. More about defining consequence. The prosecution laid it out clearly. The act. The pattern. The lack of remorse. The years without accountability. They argued for the maximum. Because anything less, they said, would fail to reflect the reality of what had happened. The defense returned to their final position.
No intent.
No plan. A situation that escalated beyond control. They asked for consideration. For recognition of ambiguity. But ambiguity had already been addressed. The jury had decided. And now, the court would finalize what that decision meant. Mark Keller was given the opportunity to speak. For the first time without questions. Without pressure. Without interruption. He stood. Looked forward.
Paused.
And then, I didn't mean for it to happen. The same sentence. Unchanged. After everything. After evidence. After testimony. After a verdict. That was all he offered.
No apology.
No acknowledgement of Melissa as a person. No recognition of the loss beyond his own perspective. Just repetition. And in that repetition, something became clear. He still didn't see it the way everyone else did. Still framed it as something that had happened to him, not something he had done. The judge listened. Expression neutral. Then delivered the sentence. Measured. Definitive. A term that ensured he would spend the rest of his life within the system he had avoided for 10 years. Not immediate justice, but eventual. Delayed, but complete. The courtroom began to empty slowly. People leaving with different emotions. Some relieved. Some unsettled. Some unsure of what they felt at all. Because closure doesn't arrive the same way for everyone. And for some, it doesn't arrive at all. Outside, the media waited. Cameras ready. Questions prepared. The story now had an ending they could report. Cold case solved. Guilty verdict. Justice after 10 years. But headlines simplify. They reduce. They compress something complex into something readable. And this case wasn't simple. Because even as one part of it closed, another remained open. David Keller. He had testified. He had admitted to hearing the words. To suspecting something serious. To choosing silence. But legally, that silence existed in a gray space. Difficult to prosecute.
Difficult to define.
Because knowing is not the same as acting. And failing to act, while morally heavy, doesn't always translate into criminal liability. Investigators considered options. Revisited statutes. Examined timelines. But the passage of time had eroded what little could have been pursued. And, in the end, no charges were filed. That decision carried its own weight. Because justice, in this case, was partial. Complete in one direction. Incomplete in another. David Keller returned to his life. But it wasn't the same. Because now, the silence that had once protected him had been replaced by visibility. Everyone knew. Everyone understood. And that kind of exposure changes everything. Neighbors no longer waved. Conversations stopped when he approached. The quiet man next door had become something else. Not a criminal. But not innocent in the way he once appeared. A presence marked by absence. By what he hadn't done. And that absence followed him. Every day. Meanwhile, the house where it happened remained. Standing.
Occupied again.
Life continuing within walls that had once held something final. Because places don't carry memory the way people do. They remain. Unchanged. While everything around them shifts, Melissa Grant's name settled into something different. No longer just a headline. No longer just a cold case.
But a story. Complete.
Documented. Understood. At least as much as it could be. But even in that understanding, something lingered. Because cases like this don't end cleanly. They leave behind fragments. Questions that don't have answers. Moments that can't be fully reconstructed. And a single, quiet truth that sits beneath everything else. It wasn't supposed to happen. Not in that neighborhood. Not in that house. Not to someone like her. And yet it did. Because sometimes the most dangerous things don't announce themselves. They don't force their way in. They knock. They wait. They appear ordinary. Until the moment they aren't. And by the time that moment passes, it's already too late. The verdict had been delivered. The sentence imposed.
The case closed.
But the echo remained. Not loud. Not overwhelming. Just present. in the spaces between words, in the memory of a night that refused to disappear, in the quiet understanding that even solved, some stories never truly end. They settle. They remain. And they remind that silence can last a long time, but eventually, it breaks. California 1998 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough exposes trusted neighbor. The verdict was supposed to be the end. For everyone watching from outside, it was a guilty verdict, a sentence, a cold case finally removed from the list of mysteries that had haunted investigators for years. But for those closest to Melissa Grant, the verdict created another silence. A different one. Because knowing who killed her did not answer every question. It did not explain every missing minute. It did not erase the years when her name appeared in old files and forgotten newspaper clippings while the man responsible continued living an ordinary life. And it certainly did not explain how a microscopic trace beneath her fingernails had survived long enough to expose him. That question began attracting attention beyond the courtroom. The DNA. The tiny fragment that had waited in evidence for years. It became the center of a larger conversation about cold cases, forensic technology, and the strange way evidence can outlive memory. In 1998, investigators had done what they could. They collected biological material. They documented it. They preserved it. But the technology available to them had limits. The sample was small. The profile incomplete. There was no database hit. No name.
No arrest.
The evidence became another unanswered line in a growing file. Then science changed. Laboratories became more sensitive. DNA extraction methods improved. Databases expanded. Techniques that once required substantial biological material could now work with microscopic traces. The same evidence. The same cells. The same fragment of skin. But a different world. That distinction mattered. Because the case had never truly lacked evidence. It had lacked a way to hear what the evidence was saying. And once investigators were finally able to hear it, the entire story changed. The breakthrough also forced authorities to revisit an uncomfortable reality. How many other cold cases were sitting in evidence rooms with answers hidden inside them? How many victims had left behind microscopic clues that technology had not yet learned to read? Melissa's case became an example of something investigators had known for years, but could now demonstrate with brutal clarity. Time does not necessarily destroy evidence. Sometimes, time gives science a chance to catch up. But there was another part of the story that refused to disappear. David Keller. The trusted neighbor. The man who had lived beside Melissa. The man who had initially appeared cooperative. The man who had never been identified as a direct participant in her death. And yet, his name remained attached to the case. Not because DNA had placed him in the bedroom. It hadn't. Not because witnesses had seen him commit anything. They hadn't. But because of what he knew. And because of what he failed to say. After the verdict, investigators returned to his statements one final time. They compared his original account from 1998 with everything revealed during the later investigation. The differences were subtle. But they were there. In 1998, David had minimized his relationship with his brother. He described Mark as distant. Occasional contact. Nothing important. Years later, the picture looked different. They had spoken. They had remained connected. And on the night Melissa died, they had talked. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. Short enough to dismiss. Long enough to matter. David had heard his brother say he had messed up. Those words became almost symbolic, because they represented the point where David could have changed everything. One call. One report. One sentence. He could have told police what he suspected. He could have forced investigators to look harder. Instead, he said nothing. And that silence lasted for years. Some people in the neighborhood could never forgive him for that. Others believed the situation was more complicated.
Fear.
Family loyalty. Denial.
Shock.
Maybe he simply could not accept what his brother had done. But whatever the reason, the result was the same. Melissa remained dead. Mark remained free. And the investigation went cold. The case file eventually became an archive of missed opportunities. Not because investigators had ignored Melissa. They hadn't. They had worked the case. They interviewed people, collected evidence, followed leads,
Tested what could be tested.
but every investigation is limited by the information available at the time. And in 1998, David's silence concealed a connection investigators didn't know existed. That was the tragedy. Sometimes an investigation doesn't fail because detectives stop searching. Sometimes it fails because the truth is hidden behind something no laboratory can immediately detect.
A lie.
A secret. A family bond. A person who says nothing. And years later, that silence can become the strongest obstacle of all. Melissa's family struggled with the knowledge that someone had known more than they did. For 10 years, they had lived without an answer. They had wondered about strangers. They had wondered about acquaintances. They had wondered whether someone from Melissa's past had returned. They had asked questions that had no answers. And all the while, one of the most important pieces of the puzzle had been only a few steps away. Next door. That realization was almost impossible to absorb. The killer had not been some mysterious figure who vanished into another state. He had been connected to someone living beside her. He had entered her world briefly, then disappeared again. The proximity made the story more disturbing, because communities often imagine danger as something distant. An unknown vehicle. A stranger passing through. A faceless predator moving from place to place. But sometimes the most frightening truth is simpler. Danger can exist inside ordinary routines. A neighbor. A visitor. A familiar face. Someone who waves in the morning. Someone whose name appears on a mailbox. Someone who looks completely ordinary until evidence reveals something else. The case also changed how people remembered the original investigation. In 1998, many residents had assumed Melissa's killer must have been an outsider. Someone who came into the neighborhood and left. That theory felt safer. It created distance. But the DNA erased that distance. The evidence brought the crime closer. Much closer. And once people learned who had been involved, old memories began resurfacing. Small things. A figure near the street. A car parked too long. A conversation overheard. A face seen once and forgotten. None of those memories had been enough to solve the case. But after the DNA breakthrough, they suddenly looked different. That is the strange power of hindsight. It changes the meaning of ordinary moments. A harmless encounter can become suspicious. A forgotten detail can become significant. A coincidence can look like a warning. Investigators understood the danger of that. Memory is not perfect. It changes with time. It absorbs later information. It fills gaps. That was why the DNA mattered so much. Unlike memory, biological evidence did not need to remember. It only needed to remain. And it had. For 10 years. The breakthrough also became a lesson in preservation. Evidence that might have been considered too small or too weak in one decade could become decisive in another. That principle transformed the way investigators approached older cases. Files were reopened. Evidence inventories reviewed. biological samples located. Some produced nothing. Some remained inconclusive. And some suddenly spoke. Melissa's case belonged to the last category. A cold case transformed by technology. A murder solved not because someone finally confessed everything, but because science found what memory had missed. And yet, the emotional reality remained unchanged. A verdict could not restore Melissa. A DNA match could not return the years stolen from her family. A prison sentence could not erase the image of an empty bedroom. Justice could define responsibility. It could not reverse death. That distinction became increasingly important as the media attention faded. The cameras disappeared. The reporters left. The courthouse became quiet. The headlines moved to newer stories. But Melissa's family carried the result home. For them, there was no closing headline. There was only life after certainty. A strange kind of grief. Before, they had asked, who? Now they knew. Before, they had asked, what happened? Now they had an answer. But certainty brought its own pain. Because the unknown allows imagination. The known leaves nowhere to hide. And perhaps that was the final lesson of the case. The truth does not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives as a laboratory report. A number. A probability. A genetic profile. A tiny biological trace recovered from beneath a victim's fingernails.
No scream. No confession. No dramatic revelation.
Just science. Patient.
Silent.
Waiting. And when the evidence finally pointed toward the man who had once been invisible, the past opened again. The trusted neighbor was no longer simply the trusted neighbor. The quiet street was no longer simply a quiet street. The bedroom was no longer just another room in an old house. Everything had changed because one fragment of evidence had survived. And somewhere in the evidence room, among boxes and envelopes and faded reports, the physical remains of that night had carried the truth for years. They had waited through investigators retiring, through witnesses aging, through headlines disappearing, through seasons changing outside the courthouse. They waited while everyone else moved forward. And eventually, when the technology became strong enough, they spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But clearly. Melissa Grant had not been forgotten. Her case had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting. Waiting for science. Waiting for persistence. Waiting for someone to ask the old question one more time. And that is why cold cases are never truly silent. They may sit untouched. They may gather dust. They may disappear from public attention. But somewhere inside them, a fragment remains. A fingerprint. A photograph. A phone record. A memory. A drop of blood. A strand of skin. Something that refuses to die with the investigation. Something that can survive years of darkness. And sometimes, decades later, that fragment becomes a voice. A voice strong enough to cross 10 years. Strong enough to expose a trusted neighbor. Strong enough to turn a forgotten murder into a solved case. But even after the courtroom closes, even after the sentence is handed down, even after the cameras disappear, one image remains impossible to forget. A quiet California street. A house next door. A porch light glowing against the darkness. And a woman who opened a door believing she was safe. The most ordinary decision. The most devastating consequence. And beneath it all, the evidence waiting patiently in the dark. Until the day the past finally spoke. California 1998 cold case solved. DNA breakthrough exposes trusted neighbor. The street was quiet again.
No reporters.
No police cars. No flashing lights reflecting against windows. The cameras had moved on. The courthouse doors had closed. The case that had once occupied shelves of dusty files was now stamped with a conclusion.
Solved.
But solved did not mean forgotten. It meant something different. It meant the questions had finally stopped multiplying. For years, Melissa Grant's family had lived inside uncertainty. They had carried a name without an ending. They had remembered a daughter, a sister, a friend, while the rest of the world slowly stopped asking what had happened. Then science changed everything. Not with a dramatic confession. Not with a stranger suddenly appearing at a police station. With something almost invisible. A microscopic trace beneath a victim's fingernails. Cells that had survived the passage of time. Evidence so small that in 1998 it could not provide the answer investigators needed. But it remained. Waiting. And when technology advanced, the evidence finally became a voice. That voice pointed toward Mark Keller, the man who had once existed on the edge of the investigation. The man whose connection to Melissa had seemed impossible to explain. The man whose DNA ultimately transformed suspicion into proof. For the community, the revelation was almost impossible to process. He had not looked like the monster people expected. There had been no obvious warning.
No dramatic ropietaschen.
No public history that announced what he was capable of. He had simply existed. Moved through ordinary spaces. Spoken to ordinary people. And, according to the evidence presented years later, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. That was what disturbed people most. Not the idea of a stranger. The idea of someone who could disappear into normal life. Someone who could stand in a neighborhood and remain invisible. Someone who could leave behind almost nothing except a fragment of biological evidence. For years, the neighborhood had searched for a face. The answer had been hiding in a bloodline. That realization changed the way people remembered everything. The old house.
The sidewalk.
The porch. The evening lights. The ordinary sounds of a California neighborhood in summer. Everything became part of the memory. But Melissa's story could not be reduced to the night she died. That was another thing her family wanted people to remember. She had been 28. A teacher. A daughter. A friend. A woman with routines and plans that had nothing to do with crime. Her life was not a prelude to her death. Her death interrupted her life. That distinction mattered. Because cold case stories can sometimes become obsessed with the killer. The suspect. The DNA. The investigation. The courtroom. But beneath all of that was a person whose future disappeared in an instant. Melissa never saw the technology that would eventually identify the man responsible. She never saw the detectives reopen the file. She never heard the words DNA match. She never watched the verdict. Her family did. And they carried those moments for her. The final years of the investigation became a strange mixture of exhaustion and determination. There were no guarantees. Cold cases can reopen and close again. Evidence can disappoint. Laboratories can produce inconclusive results. Witnesses can remember incorrectly. Suspects can deny everything. But this time the evidence held. It survived scrutiny. It survived challenges. It survived the passage of time. And that made the result different. The case was no longer based on suspicion. It was built around evidence that could be independently examined. The DNA was not a rumor. Not a memory. Not an interpretation. It was physical. And physical evidence had waited patiently while everything else changed. That is the strange power of forensic science. It does not care whether a case is 10 days old or 10 years old. It does not care whether the suspect has built a new life. It does not care whether people have stopped talking. A biological trace can remain what it was when the crime occurred.
Silent.
Unchanging. Patient. And eventually, technology can turn that silence into identification. For investigators, the case became a reminder never to underestimate evidence simply because it cannot be interpreted immediately. In 1998, the sample was a question. Years later, it became an answer. That transformation is one of the reasons cold cases continue to matter. Because unsolved does not always mean unsolvable. Sometimes it means the final piece has not been discovered yet. Sometimes it means the science has not caught up. Sometimes it means someone knows the truth but refuses to speak. And sometimes it means the evidence is sitting quietly in a box, waiting for a future investigator to open it. Melissa's case had all three: a secret, a silence, and evidence. The secret belonged to the people who knew more than they admitted. The silence belonged to those who chose not to break it. The evidence belonged to Melissa. And in the end, it was her evidence that spoke the loudest. David Keller remained one of the most troubling figures in the story. Not because the evidence established that he had committed the murder. It did not. His significance came from what investigators believed he knew after the fact. His brother had contacted him. He had heard enough to understand that something serious had happened. Yet he remained silent. For the public, that silence was difficult to understand. Some saw cowardice. Others saw family loyalty. Some believed fear had controlled him. Others believed he simply chose his brother over the truth. Whatever explanation he carried privately, the consequence was the same. 10 years passed. 10 years in which Melissa's family had no answer. 10 years in which Mark Keller remained outside prison. 10 years in which the case became colder and colder. And that is the part of the story that cannot be recovered.
Time.
No verdict can return it. No DNA test can restore it. No courtroom can give a family back the years they spent wondering. Justice can arrive late. But time never comes back. That is why the final image of the case is not the courtroom. It is the neighborhood. The street where ordinary life eventually returned. Children grew older. Houses changed owners. Trees became taller.
Cars changed.
Technology changed. The world moved forward. But somewhere beneath those changes remained the memory of one August night in 1998.
A house.
A bedroom. A woman who should have lived. And a secret that lasted far too long. Eventually, the story became part of the larger history of cold cases. Another example of how modern DNA technology can reopen investigations that once seemed impossible to solve. Another reminder that evidence can outlive the people who created it. Another warning that the absence of an immediate answer is not the same as the absence of truth. But for Melissa's family, the case was never simply an example. It was personal. It was her. And that is why the final resolution carried such complicated emotion. Relief. Anger. Sadness. Gratitude. Exhaustion. All of it could exist at the same time. A family can be grateful for justice and still hate the fact that justice took so long. They can be relieved to know the truth and still wish they had never needed to learn it. They can accept a verdict and still feel that something remains missing. Because death does not become smaller simply because a killer is identified. The empty space remains. The birthday that never happened. The conversations that never took place. The ordinary future that disappeared. Those things cannot be recovered. And perhaps that is the hardest truth in every cold case. Solving the mystery does not undo the crime. It only prevents the mystery from becoming the final chapter. Melissa's name no longer belonged only to an old file. It was no longer attached to the words unknown suspect. No longer trapped behind a question mark. The investigation had an answer. The evidence had spoken. The courtroom had confirmed responsibility. And the community could finally stop asking who had done it. But one lesson remained. Trust can be powerful. It can build neighborhoods. It can make people feel safe. It can turn strangers into familiar faces. But trust can also make danger harder to recognize. A person does not need to look threatening to be dangerous. A house does not need to look frightening to become a crime scene. A quiet street does not guarantee safety. And sometimes the most disturbing cases are not the ones where danger arrives from far away. They are the ones where danger appears close. Ordinary.
Familiar.
Almost invisible. That was what made Melissa's story so haunting. The killer did not need to announce himself. He only needed an opportunity. And afterward, silence did the rest. Until science interrupted it. Until a tiny piece of evidence refused to disappear. Until 10 years of darkness collapsed beneath the weight of a genetic profile. That is how the cold case ended. Not with a scream. Not with a chase. Not with a dramatic confession. With a laboratory result. A match.
A name.
And a truth that had waited patiently for the world to become ready for it. The street remained quiet. The houses remained standing. The nights still came. The porch lights still turned on. People still walked their dogs. Cars still passed. Life continued. It always does. But for those who remember Melissa Grant, that street carries another layer now. A memory beneath the ordinary. A reminder that every quiet place has stories. Some are forgotten. Some are buried. And some refuse to disappear. Because evidence can wait. Families can remember. Investigators can return. Technology can evolve. And a case that once seemed destined to remain unanswered can suddenly come alive again. The phrase cold case sounds final. It sounds like an ending. But it is not. It is a pause. A long silence. A file waiting on a shelf. A question waiting for the right person to ask it again. In Melissa's case, that question survived for 10 years. The answer survived too. Hidden inside something almost impossibly small. A fragment beneath her fingernails. A microscopic piece of the past. Enough to expose a man who believed time had placed distance between himself and what he had done. Enough to break a silence that had lasted a decade. Enough to prove that even when a voice is gone, evidence can still speak. And sometimes when it finally does, the whole world has to listen. Melissa Grant's story began with a quiet house. It ended with a truth that could no longer be hidden. Between those two moments were 10 years of unanswered questions, failed leads, fading memories, changing technology, and a family that refused to let her disappear completely. The case was solved. The verdict was delivered. The evidence was preserved. The killer was identified. But the memory remained. And perhaps that is the only ending a cold case can truly offer. Not forgetting. Not restoration. But recognition. A name remembered. A truth established. A silence broken. And somewhere, beneath the noise of everything that came afterward, one simple fact remained impossible to change. Melissa Grant was here. She mattered. She was loved. And for 10 years, the world did not know who had taken her life. Now it did. Because the smallest clue had survived. Because science had caught up. Because someone kept looking. And because the past, no matter how deeply it is buried, does not always stay buried forever.